Counter-Narrative News, delighted to introduce a special episode with our guest, the Ministry for African Propaganda, a brilliant young Pan-Africanist revolutionary intellect, researcher, scholar, a really terrifically modest and humble young comrade that we're delighted to have here to discuss the issues pertaining, a real controversial and central primary issue pertaining to the African masses on the continent and the diaspora, in terms of what are the type of alliances and allegiances and partnerships necessary for African people and states to really meet the challenges of poverty, of wealth distribution, all of which really inform, along with reactionary political forces and the instability, political violence, etc. Please do listen, please do engage with the Ministry of African Propaganda, really a leading young voice in radical circles today.
Campism and the war in Ukraine. Campism generally splits the world into two antagonistic orders or great camps. In simplistic terms, it is the split between the camp of capitalism and the camp of socialism, the great Cold War rivalry between the United States, its NATO allies and neo-colonies, versus the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics and its Iron Curtain puppet states. Today, it's the imperialist and capitalist West versus the others opposed to Western hegemony: China, North Korea, Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela. With these distinctions in mind, reflecting heavily on the original split between capitalism and socialism that constitutes the very foundation of the campist worldview, an important question must be asked. Why are some Western socialists and avowed anti-imperialists today proclaiming bourgeois capitalist states like Russia to be fighting for the great camp of socialism? Arguments made on social media platforms by anonymous commentators, publishings by pro-Putin, patriotic socialist political formations, and even the Russian Communist Party all claim that Moscow's brutal invasion of Ukraine serves the purpose of destabilizing US hegemony, challenging imperialist expansion through military organizations like NATO, and disrupting the exploitive Western global economic system. Frankly, these are claims, selective claims, that are as dishonest as they are delusional. Moreover, these are grotesquely revisionist and historically unfounded claims, flying disrespectfully in the face of the theoretical contributions and revolutionary analysis of Marx and Lenin. We must turn towards historical and political fact in order to debunk such positions, ensuring that the revolutionary and socialist spirit and character of the Marxist tradition are not dishonestly distorted and denigrated to support a reductionist and campist view on the inter-imperialist capitalist rivalry underpinning the Russia-Ukraine war. To be a part of the socialist camp requires fighting for the freedom and liberation of workers. This fact is indispensable. It is integral to classical definitions and articulations of campism. So, with this in mind, is Russia a socialist nation? The short, medium, and long answer is no. Russia today is a profusely neoconservative capitalist nation under the rulership of a bourgeois nationalist political party and leader. We must note that the nation rose from the ashes of the Soviet Union, welcoming in Western finance capital and corporations. McDonald's, with its famous golden arches, was nefariously plastered all over international media as finance capital's substitute for victoriously waving one's national flag over a conquered nation. Previously public-owned state assets, such as control over Russian gas and oil, were corruptly sold off to the country's parasitic, capitalist, pro-Putin oligarchs of today. Marx and Lenin would both certainly lament the whitewashing and dishonest legitimization of such oligarchs, purportedly operating with a socialist character by those who falsely claim Russia to be a socialist nation. In sum, the modern Russian state arose through a framework of neoliberalism and privatization that was overseen by the West and its liberal reformers, such as Boris Yeltsin, first president of Russia, a man who also banned the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Russia is, quite simply and very clearly, not socialist. This is a fundamental, rudimentary fact that is overwhelmingly supported by widely available historical evidence and validated by any serious Marxist. Socialism requires workers' control over the means of production, be it through the state, workers' councils, or any other form of organization and control. A brief look at Russia and we observe that the means of production are owned and controlled by the bourgeoisie, by the profiteers and the owners of business and capital, who exploit and pocket the surplus value generated by the labor of the Russian proletariat. Movements and organizations for workers' control over the means of production have been largely either suppressed or corrupted by the national bourgeois state. An example we may consider is the case of Russian communist and Volgograd mayor Roman Grebennikov, switching political allegiance in 2008 from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation to Putin's ruling United Russia Party. What kind of legitimate radical communist party, one that isn't in bed with the establishment, has its senior political figures changing their allegiance to join bourgeois, pro-capitalist, anti-communist conservative political formations? Moreover, it can be argued that the political activity of the CPRF and other socialist formations in Russian bourgeois politics directly contradict the writings of Vladimir Lenin, whose legacy they are best positioned to continue given their cultural, social, linguistic, and historical proximity to the heart of Lenin's activities, as well as their access to Soviet archives and publications, of course. Lenin was explicitly clear in his critique of bourgeois politics and participation as radicals. One must look no further than his quarrel with the Mensheviks over whether the revolutionary masses were ready for socialism and had enough familiarity and experience with democracy. The Mensheviks believed that as the era of liberal capitalism had just begun in Russia, with the successful bourgeois February Revolution toppling the Tsar, more time was needed to develop, prepare, and ready the proletariat for the socialism to come, which, according to the Marxist theory of historical materialism and stages of history, required the rule of the bourgeoisie as a necessary historical precursor to the subsequent rule of the proletariat. As such, the Mensheviks were happy to compromise and temporarily work with the capitalists, liberals, social democrats, and other groups of the provisional government that nominally controlled Russia following the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, seeking to secure provisions for workers' rights and protect what political gains they could under the new democratic order. Lenin knew this was all nonsense, recognizing that power truly rested with the Soviets, the workers' councils, rather than the Duma from which the democratic bourgeois provisional government ruled. He famously went on to lead the successful proletarian October Revolution months later. Lenin also explicitly decried bourgeois democracy for what it truly was, a shell for bourgeois interests in the state and revolution. I quote Lenin, "A democratic republic is the best possible shell for capitalism, and therefore, once capital has gained possession of this very best shell, it establishes its power so securely, so firmly, that no change of persons, institutions, or parties in the bourgeois democratic republic can shake it. To decide once every few years which members of the ruling class is to repress and crush the people through parliament, this is the real essence of bourgeois parliamentarism, not only in parliamentary constitutional monarchies, but also in most democratic republics. Therefore, with Lenin's wisdom in mind, communist parties that align their political interests and operate exclusively within the bourgeois democratic shell and not among the working masses, who should really constitute their power base, are acting in opposition to Lenin's revolutionary theory. It is extremely worrying that the Russian Communist Party has supported Putin's national bourgeois war in Ukraine. Reports even suggest that they have had contact with ultra-nationalist commanders and militants operating in eastern Ukraine's contested regions. The CPRF, just to remind people again, that's the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, their support for capitalist Russia's imperialist foreign policy, as shown to readers of Professor Luke March's analysis of the CPRF and its various factions, assessing the impact of the party's position as one of the most assiduous supporters of the Russian proxy states in the Donbass, even being the instigator of the Duma law on their recognition in February 2022, adds further fuel to legitimate concerns around the CPRF's complicity and enablement of the bourgeois capitalist establishment. Again, that any serious communist party would support a bourgeois nationalist war that has resulted in the conscripting of working class bodies tells you all you need to know about the contemporary socialist movement in Russia. The nation is no more socialist than the United States, and there seems to be no serious contender or grounded working class opposition on the political horizon. Regarding Russian imperialism, the nation's involvement in Ukraine goes back many centuries to the imperial Tsarist reigns of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, two towering figures in Russian national and imperial history, whose conquests helped shape the borders of modern Russia. Both monarchs recognized the importance of importing ruling cultures, logics, institutions, and functions from Western Europe into the backward and decaying Russian aristocracy, with their reigns becoming famed for their modernization, i.e., an aristocratic alliance with the bourgeoisie and the social-political adoption of the Western European model of imperial expansion, colonial dispossession, labor and resource expropriation, etc. They significantly expanded Russian territory through violence and bloodshed, annexing places with a strong political relevance today, such as Crimea, conquered by the mid-18th century. It is undoubtedly of no coincidence that almost 300 years later, Russia would once again invade, conquer, and annex Crimea in 2014 under President Putin, who even likened himself to Peter the Great. The Russian Empire began to refer to the area known as Ukraine today, including Crimea, as Little Russia, further reflecting its adoption of the norms of Western European colonization, in this case, imposing names and shaping the cultures and identities of those who were conquered, colonized, exploited, oppressed, and dispossessed. As many Ukrainians would proudly point out, their national history extends far beyond the Russian imperialism of the 18th century, with clear Polish and European influences observable today in the country's architecture, language, and culture. Ukraine's distinct national history and nationhood were indeed even recognized by the likes of Lenin, whose recognition of the above was attacked and decried by Putin as a mistake that placed a time bomb under Russia. In Putin's view, explicitly announcing his condemnation of Lenin to the world during a speech on the special military operation in Ukraine, Lenin was responsible for the disintegration of our united country. This fact, once again, calls into question the true allegiance of Russian communists, who seem to be more aligned with the imperialist and anti-Leninist foreign policy of the capitalist Putin than they are with the communist Lenin. Similarly, this extends to pro-Russia campists, who seem happy to align with anti-communists and unconcerned by the legitimization of anti-Leninist discourses, even as socialists and communists themselves. For more examples of Russian imperialism, we need not even look beyond Russia's current imperial borders, which, like the United States, Canada, Australia, and other settler colonial nations, are masked as federal borders. Dagestan and Chechnya are two non-Orthodox, non-Russian locales that were violently conquered, colonized, and incorporated into the Russian Empire following wars and conquests in the 18th and 19th centuries. Both places have, in recent decades, seen a flurry of separatist violence as religious and cultural liberation movements sought freedom and independence from Moscow's authoritarian rule. The bombing of Grozny during the Second Chechen War, the regional capital of Chechnya, had photographs of a particularly nasty and gruesome aftermath circulating throughout international media. Russian imperialism in Dagestan and Chechnya has spawned, in reaction, violent Islamic extremism following the hundreds of thousands of dispossessed and countless lives lost to the many wars of conquest and subsequent centuries-long iron fist used to maintain Moscow's rule over what they saw as peripheral regions of their empire. Sadly, this imperial condition continued throughout Soviet rule, particularly in the post-Lenin era. A prime example of this would be the reign of Joseph Stalin. His forced population transfers of over 171,000 ethnic Koreans to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, alongside his responsibility for the violent excesses of the liquidation of the kulaks as a class, forming a significant part of the tragic historical event referred to as the Holodomor genocide, joins a long list of Russian imperial atrocities taking place under both Tsarist and Soviet regimes. Bourgeois and Soviet historians disagree on the death toll, but one thing must be agreed by all: even one death is one too many. The point is clear. Russia has an indisputable record, both contemporary and historical, of imperial violence, colonial dispossession, and attacks on civilian populations resisting the rule of a people, culture, language, religion, and civilization that is foreign to them. Russia's imperialism can rightly be argued to be dwarfed by the West's imperialism. Hundreds of millions slaughtered and entire continents dispossessed and colonized. That's correct. But we must not forget that the experience of such violence is subjective. It's easy to downplay and dismiss Russian imperial genocides and militaristic aggression when you're not in Ukraine, when you're not in Chechnya, when you're not in Dagestan, Georgia, and other places decimated and permanently shaped by the above atrocities. So what does this mean for the campus positions incorrectly embraced by socialists and anti-imperialists today? Well, a campus view of the world that is characterized and weakened by such naked hypocrisies, historical revisionism, and legitimization of anti-communists, such as their support for capitalists attacking Lenin, the campist position on the Ukraine war specifically, and generally when seeking to understand conflict in the 21st century, is one we should not really take serious as principled Marxists. Such views should be dismissed and disregarded for the ahistorical, counterproductive, reductionist takes and assumptions on which they are founded. As this article has shown, the Russian Communist Party is in bed with the bourgeois nationalist establishment. Patriotic socialists and similar nationalist heresies of Marxism remain fringe and are as alienated by the establishment as they are by any serious socialist formation. Social media users who call for Ukraine's total annexation by capitalist Russia, alongside its ethnic cleansing through the derogatory dismissal of Ukrainian culture and nationhood, are anonymous for a reason. Criticism of Ukraine's own ultranationalist bourgeoisie, NATO approachment, the state sanctioning of far-right groups and neo-Nazi iconography in politics, such as that of the notorious Azov Battalion, now an incorporated regiment of the Ukrainian National Guard, should rightly be discussed, considered, and condemned. To ignore these facts and critiques would be to risk falling into a similarly incorrect campus position. Neo-Nazi whitewashing and right-wing overtures should always be attacked. However, it is an extreme generalization to suggest that the entire Ukrainian state is fascist or aligns with such views. Similarly, this serves to erase the loud voice and resistance of Ukrainian socialists, who are struggling against the rise and empowerment of domestic nationalism alongside their resistance against the brutal Russian invasion. Finally, we must take into calculation that the fact of a brutal invasion and violation of national sovereignty will always lead to right-wing overtures and the empowerment of reactionary groups and ideologies. We witness this in Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and Afghanistan, all places where foreign intervention ended up empowering extremists and reactionaries rather than the pre-existing socialist formations. This is especially true in Afghanistan, where the Soviet invasion and the later US occupation both served only to embolden and empower conservative reactionaries like the Mujahideen and then the Taliban, who similarly gained reductionist campus support from Western anti-imperialists seeking to counter the US, no matter whom that meant they ended up supporting. The only position for Marxists and anti-imperialists to take here would be to align our interests with the Ukrainian and Russian working masses, proletarian minds and bodies whose lives have been derailed, whose homes and communities have been decimated, and whose bodies are being conscripted for a war they did not want. A Russian victory will only embolden Putin, his neoconservative bourgeois capitalist regime, and the Duginist strategic geopolitical vision for the wider region. Of course, a Ukrainian victory, the liberation of Crimea and the Donbass region from Russian or proxy occupation or otherwise, would embolden NATO and strengthen Western regional hegemony too. But at least with the latter, Russia's bourgeoisie will be significantly weakened by this unpopular war, and the class struggle in Ukraine could resume. It is a fact that the class struggle cannot take place under conditions of foreign occupation. So the defense and the liberation of Ukraine is a necessity for Ukrainian socialists. Likewise, the weakening of the firm, decades-long grip and domestic political hegemony held by the Russian bourgeoisie is a necessary step for the Russian class struggle. The successful defense of Ukraine's national sovereignty and territorial integrity is the best possible and most desirable outcome for the fighting, struggling, sweating, toiling, resisting, laboring, and working masses of both nations.